You're listening to Raincoast Radio.
Welcome to More Than a Fish, Season 2 of Raincoast Radio. I'm Austin Chor, a salmon habitat biologist at Raincoast and your host for this series of conversations about the connections between salmon, people, and place. My guest today is Jessica Hutchinson. Jessica is a restoration biologist and executive director of Redfish Restoration Society, an organization based in Ucluelet that is at the forefront of habitat restoration efforts on the west coast of Vancouver Island. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Austin. Happy to be here.
So we ask all our guests about their home waters because salmon are inherently tied to their home waters. They have all these unique attributes that make each population tied to the specific place that they go back to. And so we wanted to know, where are your home waters and what are they like?
Yeah, I grew up in just outside of Vancouver in the Lower Mainland in Tsawwassen Nations territory. And so those are my home waters. I grew up spending lots of time on the river in the summer, on the Fraser River, and in Boundary Bay as well. But I've been here on the west coast of Vancouver Island in Tlaloquit and Ucluelet Nations territory for 20 years now. So I really do feel like the west coast is home for me.
So you're the executive director of Redfish Restoration Society. Could you tell me a little bit about what the organization is all about, and also what's in the name, Redfish?
Yeah, so Redfish, we are a registered charity. This is actually our 30th anniversary this year since 1995. So, yeah, longer than I've been with the organization, but our focus is really ecosystem restoration, recovery, and really helping accelerate areas and watersheds that have been damaged by human activities and trying to inspire this ethic of stewardship and reconnecting people with these spaces and these places to help conservation in the long term. And Redfish. So I guess the name is important to us. We used to have this other name as an organization called Central West Coast Forest Society. It was long, it was cumbersome, nobody remembered it. It didn't really speak volumes to what we did. So we knew we wanted something simple and short and sweet, and Redfish was a perfect fit. A red, two Ds, it is a word that means, it speaks to the salmon nest. So any species of fish that lays their nest in gravel, that's a red. And we thought the red was kind of indicative of our holistic approach to restoration, because a red is influenced by all life cycles of the salmon. It's influenced by the habitat that they're constructed in. It's influenced by the water that flows through it, by the rain that falls on it, by the trees that shade it and protect it. And it's influenced by the size of the fish and how many eggs are laid there, which is a factor of ocean conditions. So it really symbolizes all of those interconnections. And so for us, and the work that we do, being restoration in both the marine, the terrestrial, and the aquatic freshwater, we thought it was like a really great fit for us as an organization.
And I think something that's unique that I've noticed about Redfish is that you're very public facing. Like, you have a store, you have these like really cool YouTube videos that are like really well put together. And I'll just be like walking around Vancouver and I'll see Redfish merch on strangers, right? Like Redfish hats. I have one, and I think that's really unique in terms of NGOs out here and charities. And so how important is that like public connection and that public facing side of the organization?
I think it's really important. Like when I first started with this organization 20 years ago, nobody knew what restoration was. Nobody heard about river restoration, habitat restoration. So I think it's really important for any organization that's doing this work to get the message out there so that more people understand that conservation alone isn't enough, and we need to do something to help ecosystems that have been damaged to recover. So if we can get that message out there through some splashy marketing or social media or through merch, like anything helps tell that story. That's the direction we're going to go. And, I have like a slight small passion for marketing and media and for design. So it's something that's always been close to my heart. If I want to operate a nonprofit, I believe strongly in this social enterprise, but I also, I see that in order to reach more people, we need to sort of use different avenues, and we can't just keep our story small. We need to reach out and find other ways to engage people in this work.
I think that's something we've been, a lot of other ENGOs have been struggling with is getting the message out to the quote unquote the general public, people who don't really know anything about the issue, but could and would probably be really interested and passionate about it if they just had that first step, right?
Yeah. And restoration is complicated, so it's hard to really convey those messages easily in a bite-sized form. So, that's why we often turn to images and videos and films just as a way to like capture people's attention and then try and draw them into the story. And I think it's been effective for us. Like we are a small organization, we work in a very small part of the province, but yet our voice is fairly large just because we've done it in a directed effort or in a thoughtful way.
And could you tell me, so you came from the Lower Mainland, grew up in Vancouver. Could you tell me how you ended up in Ucluelet, way, way, way out in the West Coast?
Yeah, so well, I actually live in Tofino, and my parents lived there in the 70s. My dad was a float plane pilot for Tofino Air, and my mom did the books for a local construction company. And so they lived here through the 70s, and then they moved away right before my sister was born to the Lower Mainland. And then we kind of came out every summer ever since. So it always been like a part of my life, Tofino and this area, and it always held a part of my heart. And then when I was doing my undergrad at UBC, I thought my brother and I actually were like, let's move to Tofino for the summer. And I thought I could get a little work experience working in the marine environment or in the terrestrial environment, doing various jobs out here. And we both wanted to learn how to surf, so that seemed like a good excuse as well. And then I just never left, and neither did he. And now my mom and my dad moved back a couple of years ago as well. So yeah, it's definitely home now.
Great place to call home.
Yeah.
So I want to move on to talking about kind of the main topic of the day. And so I saw you talk. I feel like a lot of the guests at our podcast, I first met at the PSF conference in December. And I saw your talk on process-based restoration. And it was, you remember that conference was super quick, like it was just boom, 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 boom. And your talk really stood out to me as like, it really changed how I view habitat restoration. And I was like, I need to learn more about this because I just saw a talk about how, they were looking at old habitat restoration sites and how they were completely non-functional, how they got grown over and all this stuff. And so process-based restoration, could you explain it to me like you would explain it to your parents? What is process-based restoration and why is it different from regular old restoration?
So, in order for restoration to be effective, we need to look at the root causes of the degradation that occurred. So, what is causing the problem that is impeding the ecosystem or impeding the focal species from recovering? So, we need to get to the start of the problem. Too often, restoration is a band-aid or a small short-term fix, and it's not addressing the actual process that has been impaired. And that process may be a hydrological process, it may be a terrestrial process or a nutrient process, it may be the fact that we no longer have large volumes of salmon returning to the river, kicking off that nutrient cycle. It may be that we've impaired the hydrological conditions in a watershed and water is now returning to the river at a faster rate. And so if we aren't addressing those root causes, we're never actually going to fix the problem. And I think so often organizations are focused on these band-aid approaches because they are quicker, they are a short-term approach to a solution. And these process-based approach to restoration is going to take longer. It's perhaps going to be more costly. And it's going to also require a lot more assessments and digging into the watershed to understand really what is hampering its recovery. And so for us, process-based restoration is that holistic look at the entire watershed and all of the processes that have been impaired through humans altering the landscape or altering the ecosystems. And then digging into actually helping where the limiting factors are occurring. So I guess this is not a very good example of how I would explain it to my mom.
We all have the same problem. Whenever my parents ask me what I do, I'm like,
Exactly. Okay. I'm doing a
Yeah. Could you
terrible
give me an
job.
example of what a process-based restoration project could be?
Yeah, for sure. So in our systems out here, large trees with huge root masses, massive western red cedars, Sitka spruces used to grow on the banks of these rivers. And they are what shaped the river itself. So when a tree of that size falls into a river, there's a process that occurs. It creates scour, it creates habitat for fish. And with the lack of these large trees growing on the banks of the river, we are not going to see that habitat. We're not going to see those processes occur. So, our focus is not just on putting wood back into the river, which would be a band-aid. It would create a pool. We could build a log jam there and we would get that pool, we'd get that process, and that would be a short-term solution to a problem. But we need to look deeper at that and we need to look at why aren't there trees growing on the banks of this river and how can we invest in this watershed for the long term and fix that process and get trees growing back on the river. So we might do a short-term solution of building a log jam in a river and create that short-term response, but we also have to look at the processes that have been impaired. And maybe just planting a tree on the banks of that river isn't going to actually solve the problem. Maybe there's a greater problem of why trees aren't regrowing on the bank of the river. So we might have to dig even deeper into how can we help support trees growing on this river again. Maybe planting a tree there just isn't enough if you haven't addressed something else that's impairing trees from growing on the banks of the river. So again, it's about understanding all the processes that are at play and finding the ones that are causing the problem of why habitat's impaired or species aren't recovering.
So it doesn't sound like it's an either or, right? Like you don't have to do just look at the root cause or just the symptom. It's kind of a bit of both.
Yeah, I think the other problem with, back to your comment about like a lot of restoration projects haven't been successful. And that is, again, I think we're not matching the scale of the problem to the scale of the damage. So often restoration projects will be small in scale. It'll focus on a single portion of a river, it'll focus on a single attribute that's been impaired. But we need to look at the larger scale. We need to invest in habitat restoration. We need to invest in large scale recovery for these systems. And yeah, take multiple approaches to that.
Yeah, and one thing I'm always curious about with restoration is that like the word restoration implies going back to something, right? How do you know what that state is? How to restore it back to something? Or, could restoration be forward looking as well?
Yeah, or maybe we shouldn't even use the term restoration because, yeah, it implies that we can actually take it back to something it was before. And that's probably not true. It's more about accelerating recovery and stewardship and investing in these watersheds for the long term. So, yeah, I feel like we often hate the word restoration because it's not true. Like sometimes these watersheds or these systems have been beaten up so much that that's really actually not a functional goal is restoring it to a pre-condition. Or when these ecosystems developed over thousands of years, how can you ever expect to restore it? No, you probably won't, but you might be able to find ways to accelerate its recovery or put it on a trajectory of healing or, engage people in the watershed to build connections so that, over generations we can see to its healing and recovery.
And because a lot of these processes take so long, like as you're saying, these forests are 1,000 years old and these, rivers are shaping themselves over hundreds, thousands of years. How do you get people on board to support that? To not just try to get something done really quick, but try to convince them of investing in this future.
Yeah, I think it's easier to convince people to invest in like the stewardship and the care on a personal level when you're connected to a place and you've, worked in the watershed or you live in the watershed. I feel like it's often the funders. Political cycles are short and funding cycles are short and funders often grow tiresome of a single watershed. And they're like, I've heard enough about that watershed. Haven't you restored it already? Like, let's move on. Check that box. But that's something that, again, it's like maybe storytelling and engaging people that, like, no, we always have this like motto that we don't like walk away from a watershed, that maybe that's why we're not restoring 50 watersheds and we're only working in 13 is because, with every watershed we take on, it's like a relationship and a commitment to that watershed and knowing that we're not just like doing a project and walking away and hope it worked. We are there, we're coming back every year, we're learning, we're tweaking, it's this relationship and this commitment to these places that's going to see to their recovery in the long term. And so again, we fall back on storytelling to hopefully, engage funders and let them. And I think in my time with Redfish, I've seen that change. I remember when I first started, it was like 1 year projects. We won't fund a project again the second year. But there is a shift and people are realizing that like, no, actually that's not a suitable approach to restoration. We need to invest long term. So
Yeah, and I guess like both at the political level and at the funder level, they really want to see a result like quick, right? And it's hard to, because then they're like, where did my money go, or where did my support go, right? And that's something. Yeah, it's interesting. It's good to hear from you that that's starting to shift, right?
I think so. Yeah, I think people aren't seeing that like, okay, yeah, we can move on. It's like, no, there's a lot of stories to tell here in this watershed, and being committed to a watershed isn't a failing. We may not be able to say this watershed is completely restored and you've checked that box, but you have a different story to tell, and that story is, yeah, commitment.
So you work in 13 watersheds. How did those get, selected? Was it based on how degraded they were? Was it based on, some other reasons?
Yeah, so Redfish is really unique in that at our governance level and our board of directors, we work with the 5 nations in our region, and each of those 5 nations appoint a representative to our board. And so we work independently with each nation and they set the priorities for the work that we do. So our work is very much led by the nations. So in terms of choosing the watershed, that comes back to the nation. And those choices are often made on the condition of the watershed or its historical abundance or its value to the nation or a specific species that they're concerned about within the watershed. So again, it's really taking direction from the nations on their priorities. Sometimes it comes down to access and feasibility as well. That plays a part. Some watersheds may be critical or very high priority, but access is limited and costs are too high. Those aren't ever factors that we like rule out restoration in, but it definitely bears on how much investment we can make into a watershed if access is poor or the feasibility is low.
Yeah, and I just finished speaking with Tom Rutherford the other day. He was saying how a lot of his work has turned into less about science and fish and engineering and way more on the social side. And how much of your work is working with people, figuring out how to collaborate or disagree or work through conflicts or build relationships and that sort of thing?
It's a huge part of every aspect of the work we do is relationships. So relationships at our governance level with each nation is so critical. And it's something we, invest so much time and energy in maintaining those relationships and working with the nations so closely is really critical. I'd say even our relationship with the watershed, it's something I speak about a lot, is that we need to, understand the conditions of the watershed, invest time in these watersheds to truly understand where restoration can be most effective. So again, that's a relationship with the land and the water, and then relationship with funding and partners and people who are investing in recovery. Those are all critical. And then as a manager, at Redfish, of course, it's our interpersonal relationships of our team and all the different contractors and groups that we work with to pull these complicated projects off. So I'd say relationships are huge, and really like so much of the work that Redfish does is about supporting nations' land use vision and supporting work to engage the nation in the watershed and in its recovery and its stewardship and getting youth out on the land. So yes, I completely agree with Tom that relationships are absolutely foundational to successful restoration.
I think one thing I'm still trying to wrap my head around is so I work in Merritt in the Nicola, and a lot of the impacts that the watershed has faced are from extractive industry or agriculture. And it's such a big part of the community is that legacy of industry, and it brings, jobs, economic growth, sends people to college. And I want to know if that's the same story out on the West Coast and with logging industry, and how do you see restoration fitting into this so that maybe more people can get more jobs doing working for redfish and less for a timber company.
Yeah, so I think one thing that Redfish does really well is we try not to, we're not an advocacy group. We're not anti this or anti that. We really try and build bridges. So a lot of the contractors we work with, they're fallers coming out and they're helping on our restoration projects, doing, let's say, a thinning project or topping trees to help create wildlife habitat within second growth forests, or we're working with contractors and excavator operators and people who are still involved in industry or historically used to work in these watersheds doing the logging that we're hoping to repair these watersheds from. So, and I find that because we're not approaching it as like we're opposed to these industries, it actually helps bring people on board and it's part of their story now too. So a lot of the fallers that we worked with, they were there in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and they were the ones who logged these watersheds. And they also enjoy being part of the story about learning from those past mistakes and seeing that forestry was done differently at that time. And now they're a part of something to heal and to recover, and they see themselves in that story. So I think that's really powerful in terms of like building those connections with those groups and bringing those people into the restoration story. And I also think that, our organization is unique in that we started in the 1990s, and that was a time when there was a downturn in the forest industry, and there was also the commercial buyback of commercial fishing licenses. And so a lot of the funding that helped our organization get going in the 90s was all about putting people back to work out of these industry downturns. And so, that's something where we also fill a gap. And often in years where cedar prices are lower and logging is less here on the coast, we help put loggers back to work continuously. We're providing employment for local fallers or local contractors and excavator operators when there's a downturn in the building and development within our local communities. And so, again, I think it's about creating opportunities. We work so hard to raise funds and bring money to the coast and create employment and create long-term employment and create contracts. And I think all of that activity while trying to create an organization that is inclusive and building bridges to these groups helps, really make us like a community foundation that people can get behind and that people, rely on. We also have, we often use local float plane companies and helicopter companies to get us to our remote locations. And so I know during COVID, when there was a lack of tourism in the area and these helicopter and float plane companies were seeing less business, we helped supplement that industry during that downturn by, we had active projects and funding. And so again, I think it's worked well for us in terms of like, making connections and supporting local industries and not being an advocacy group and trying to, change from within.
Do you see this sector, the restoration sector, growing? And if you do, where could that money come from?
Yeah, I do see it growing. We know that in the US, the restoration industry is $1 billion industry. It supports massive sectors within forestry, yeah. So in the US, it's a $1 billion industry, and in Canada, we're leaps and bounds behind. So I do think there's definitely room for growth within the sector, within the province. And conservation financing from outside this region, from outside this country, is something that we should be doing a better job of tapping into and bringing dollars to our province and to our country to invest in restoration that would have a benefit not only locally or regionally, but actually at a much larger scale. So I look forward to BC becoming more of a leader in the restoration industry. And I really hope that Redfish is, one of those voices that will help elevate the story to achieve that in the recent future.
What is conservation financing?
Well, just bringing in philanthropic support, bringing funding from other groups, from other regions, and really it's an idea of investing in what we often call a restoration economy in giving back to these watersheds so that, we reap the benefits and we understand that these healthier watersheds create healthier communities and healthier economies.
I was wondering what your experience was with the feeling of one step forward, two steps back, with thinking about climate change and how we can almost try to keep up with how the habitat's being degraded and it's no longer just with, by industry and by our practices, but now it's also something that is much harder to control in a way. You have fires, you have floods. How have you been able to prioritize keeping on top of this, like constantly chasing the degradation, or are you setting up these projects with that in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's when you frame it that way, it's absolutely depressing because I'm still trying to clean up
Sorry.
messes that were made in the 1950s and 60s and 70s and still trying to help watersheds recover from that damage. And then we pile on that well, industries, being green lighted and we're trying to, make more mines and lay more pipes and log more areas. And so I think where I see encouragement and where I think there's hope is that, and where I want to focus more energy is in policy. And I want to see in the coming years that within government, we have ways to streamline and greenlight good restoration projects. Because right now, there isn't really a process for restoration within our province. If you want to get a project for restoration off the ground, you kind of have to fit a circular, what is the line? You're trying to fit it into a process, a policy, a framework that isn't designed for restoration. So, in order for me to get a forest restoration project off the ground, often I'll have to pursue a cutting permit or go through a forestry avenue. Or if I'm trying to do a river restoration project, I'll have to go through a permitting process that someone who's trying to make a road or install a bridge is going through. So we need avenues to help greenlight restoration, help speed up and reduce the impediments and the barriers to getting good restoration projects off the ground. And I think if we are going to, continue to tear up this earth and cause damage, we have to create processes that will help us like speedily come in after and help recovery.
I know what you mean because my colleague Dave, he says this a lot too. He's like, with all the talk about fast tracking all these
Yeah,
projects, like, why can't they just fast track my
yeah,
project, my restoration project?
no.
They're stuck in permitting. They're, trying to get all these little legal things figured out. That's really interesting angle to hear, especially from you as well, that it's hard to, like, bureaucratically, right? Yeah.
Bureaucratically, but even just like if you are just someone trying to, or a consulting company, and you're trying to get a restoration project off the ground, there's very little information. Like we've set our systems up to support industry, but we haven't set our systems up to support restoration. So we need to have better systems in place to move restoration ahead if we're going to try and even keep pace with industry, let alone clean up historical industry.
And you said the Redfish is not an advocacy organization, but is this something that you could get behind?
Yeah, well, this is less about, yeah, this is a change that I think is really needed. And yeah, this is something I would certainly get behind. And I think like there's some rays of sunshine and hope. And we now have ministries that are, have the word stewardship in them.
Could we have a minister of restoration, like a minister of habitat restoration? Yeah.
Yeah, there's opportunities. So yeah, hopefully we just create more efficiencies in that regard.
So I'd love to hear about some of your actual projects. Is there one that is in your mind that's like, this one is awesome and I love to tell everybody about it? Because if so, I'd love to hear about
Well, we have so many projects. I think the
it.
Tranquil project is probably one that's nearest and dearest to my heart in that we've done so much work in that watershed. We've done landslide stabilization, bioengineering on these landslides to help them turn off the taps and reduce the sediment that's flowing down to the river below. We've done hectares and hectares of forest restoration. That watershed was absolutely nuked in the lower valley. They logged 90% of it, so there's less than 10% old growth remaining on the banks of the river. And we've it grew back almost pure hemlock in the coniferous sections, and the deciduous areas are pure red alder. And we've planted so many trees to help bolster that recovery and accelerate it to mix coniferous deciduous stands and healthy riparian forest for that river. We've done countless log jams, engineered log jams, and the river is looking amazing. So excited to see the winter rains come and to see that river shape and change over time and to see the salmon return and utilize all that new habitat we've created. But this week, I went out to Lost Shoe Creek in Uklathot Nation's territory, and this is a watershed that I actually did my master's research on, and we did some forest restoration. We thinned dense second growth, and this is in Pacific Rim National Park Reserve in the Long Beach unit. And it was logged in the 1970s and then planted right after it was logged because it was going to become a national park. So they planted it, and they planted Douglas fir, which is inappropriate species for that ecosystem. And so it's grown back with a dense thicket of Douglas fir and natural Western hemlock reseeded as well. So these are really tightly spaced forests. And anyways, in 2010, for my master's research, we thinned it to open up the forest and allow more light into the forest floor. And we planted understory trees to get an appropriate mixture of tree species growing there again. Anyways, fast forward now 14 years later, I just went back out to the site this week and saw the forest and was so happy just to see how that forest restoration has worked. And, I was a little nervous because I hadn't been there in a couple years, and just to see it come back to life with like lush understory vegetation, so many berry species, fruit bearing shrubs. Yeah, it was just an amazing place to be and to see that recovery in just a 10-year time span or 14-year time span. So it was really, that place holds a special place in my heart. And to see it come back to life and to see all the trees that we had planted in 2010 and 2011 and their growth. And yeah, it was really cool to go back and very rewarding to see the restoration and see it work.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because I think most people would be really amazed that we can shape things for the better as big as a forest or a river, right? That you can kind of encourage it to go this way or that way and shape an entire forest. I think that's really cool. And to be able to see the results like 15 years later is really cool, because I think it's also, again, very easy to see these places as static and that you can't change them or
Yeah.
and that sort of thing, and that they were always like this. Yeah, it's interesting to hear that Douglas fir, or they were planted there, and because if I were to walk around in that forest, I'm sure I'd be like, oh, this just looks like a forest, but you're able to look at it and be like, this is artificial or this doesn't fit.
Yeah, it's part of that watershed story for sure. That was the merchantable tree. That was what was growing in the 1970s in nurseries. That's what they were planting. So they planted it there. And yeah, the fact that they logged it right before it became a national park too is an interesting part of the story. And yeah, and so the neat part too is that we set up these control plots as part of my master's where no restoration was done, and they look exactly the same. Like the only thing growing on the forest floor is the odd mushroom. The trees are still really tightly packed and very skinny and tall. And then in the part where we did do the thinning, the trees have packed on some girth and they're much wider and the boles are bigger and the canopies are wider and taller, and so there's been growth on all aspects, and I imagine the root masses are probably larger as well, and then the understory vegetation and berry shrubs. And yeah, it was just really powerful to see that response in a relatively short time period.
Are there any parallels with your work and all this like land stewardship and process-based restoration with how indigenous peoples would manage the lands that they live on?
Well, I think the greatest parallels lie in like the principles that guide our restoration. And that's like, respect for the land. And so like that ESOC, that in Chalmers it's called ESOC. So having respect and creating that relationship with the watersheds. I would say also that, there's that care that we give to the systems too. So that Walathuk. So I think, yeah, a lot of our guiding principles that we use to shape the work we do and the approaches we take to restoration I think very much, and like you say, process-based restoration again is like it's very much guided by like indigenous understanding of a system. And I think that's what we need to go back to in order for restoration to be effective, is less of this like quick and dirty restoration. I planted a tree, I dug a side channel, I walked away, I learned nothing, I didn't create a connection. And going back to that, I'm going to spend some time in this watershed. I'm going to get to know it. I'm going to do my assessments. I'm going to study the heck out of it. I'm going to find what the problem is. And then I'm going to try my best to help it recover and heal, but I'm going to stick around and see if it worked. And if it didn't, then I'm going to keep, engaging in the watershed and be a part of it. And I think there's a lot of those lessons come from Indigenous knowledge.
Yeah, and I think that, growing up, I was very into environmental work and studied biology, and I feel like there might still be this school of thought of just leave it alone, like don't do anything. What do you think of that? Is it better sometimes to just leave something alone and let, quote unquote, let nature do its thing, or do we sometimes need to intervene?
It's something we hear all the time, especially on social media. We'll say something about some restoration program and they're like, just leave it alone. Nature heals itself. What are you doing? Blah, blah, blah. Especially people hate to see excavators. They hate to see getting cut. People have a hard time thinking that that could actually do something healing. So I, like a fellow colleague, always uses this metaphor story to like, okay, if you got the crap kicked out of you, if you got beat up, ribs broken, arms broke, like, are you going to heal naturally or are you going to go to a doctor and get things fixed? Like, there is a point where we've hurt things so badly that healing naturally isn't actually a recovery trajectory. You need to seek support to actually get you on a healing path. And so, yes, there are times where we go into a watershed and, we've been asked to come see it or, and you look at it and you're like, no, actually, this does look like it's on the right path. And, it's self-thinning, the forest is thinning, or the creek actually does have enough wood, or the creek is small enough that the wood it has is functional and it's on a path of recovery. But that's not the case for a lot of the systems that we work in. It's not the case for a lot of the lands that humans occupy. We have kicked it to a place that no natural healing is actually going to occur or actually be of enough effect to get a healing recovery. And then if you lie that on top of the fact that salmon often in these watersheds are declining at such a fast rate that we don't have the time to wait for that healing recovery to occur, or that natural healing to occur. So we need to help accelerate recovery. So I think it's about, like, again, getting to know the watershed, finding ways and finding those places that do need a helping hand and getting it on that path of recovery.
I think one of the points that a lot of people listening to this will be really intrigued by is that we're talking about salmon habitat, but we are mostly talking about trees and about the forest, right? And that like linkage, I think a lot of people don't make, right? And we know the salmon are important for the forest, but is the forest important to the salmon?
Oh yeah, and it goes beyond like some of our more recent restoration is focused on kelp forests. So we are actually doing kelp restoration for salmon. So, these are the forests and the structure that salmon need in the ocean. And almost you could argue equally as important as the trees on the banks of the river. So yeah, salmon are these unique species that have such a multifaceted life history and so many factors at play to their success. Like, for salmon, it's death by 1,000 cuts of why they're declining. And so we're gonna have to take all these different approaches to help their recovery, help the habitat that they rely on in their different life phases to recover and support a higher level of abundance.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is the kelp forest important for the salmon. That makes sense because salmon live in the water and kelp forests are also in the water. But how is a big hemlock or a giant cedar way up the mountain? How is that important for a salmon?
Yeah, like one thing too, like we do landslide stabilization, road deactivation, and these are in steep terrain where a salmon has never been, a salmon will never go. We're up on mountainsides, kilometers from any juvenile egg or adult salmon. But yet these habitats are connected to the river and the estuary below. So we need to look at the entire system. We need to do salmon habitat restoration in places salmon will never be because of this connection within these watersheds. A lot of, like, for instance, too, like in Heshkut Nation's territory, these are chum runs, these are chum rivers, and the estuaries the chum rely on have been absolutely decimated. But the estuary hasn't been decimated itself. It was decimated by the landslides, kilometers way up. All of that sediment has now moved down through the river and is puked out into the estuary and buried all of the salt marsh habitat, all of the clam beds the nations used to manage. And all of that habitat has been destroyed by something so disconnected, in a sense, so far away from the estuary. And so our estuary restoration is actually up on a mountain slope.
Yeah, that's really cool, and I think that's a theme that a lot of people on this podcast have been bringing up, is that it's not just where the salmon go in the water, it's like way, way, way more than that, right?
Right.
Because yeah, rivers are these dynamic systems, and I come from Ontario where a lake just makes sense, right? A lake is just a body of water and it's just this contained little ecosystem. But when you think about rivers, it's where is it going? What's going into it? It's going out into the ocean, and all these little like different interactions I think are really interesting. Yeah.
For sure. And like wetlands on the banks of rivers. And yeah, it's all so important, so connected. And we've altered it so much.
In regards to how your work is done, like the practice of process-based restoration, is there something that's kind of like a new and developing technique or concept that you're excited about?
Well, I guess I am really excited about our kelp restoration activities and advancing kelp restoration in our region. We've done 5 years now of monitoring our kelp forests along the coasts with the nations that we're working with. And we've seen, even in that short time period, a recession of the kelp forests. And so now we're moving towards some kelp restoration opportunities and trying to bring kelp back to these ecosystems. And so that's one that I'm really excited about. And I do hope that the science and the work behind it really advances in the next few years, and that this industry really takes off in terms of reseeding areas for kelp. Other than that, I'm always really passionate about our river restoration projects. We work with a team of engineers and fluvial geomorphologists to design some really innovative approaches to river restoration. These are really large scale restoration projects. So we're targeting a large section of a river with huge engineered log jams. We're really investing in these systems. So it's really unique. I feel like often restoration for rivers, a few logs are placed in a river in the hopes that it scours a pool, but we're really looking at the entire fluvial landscape and using engineered log jams to influence how a river is shaped and really trying to rebuild it. Again, a colleague that I work with says it's often like a more of a sledgehammer approach. We're not coming in doing little tweaks, coming in, and we are really doing some really innovative work.
With the kelp restoration, how does that work? Are you out there and like diving down and planting kelp, or how does that work?
Yeah, so we kelp restoration, you have to collect the spores within the region that you're going to do the kelp restoration within a really small scale approach. So we're collecting within 50 meters of where the kelp restoration will occur. So we collect those spores, and then they're grown in a lab on a string of twine. And then that twine that they begin to grow over the winter, and then come spring, we unwind that twine that was grown in the lab with all the spores now growing on it and put it into an in-ocean nursery in the marine environment. And these are just ropes slung from anchors, and they're elevated above the ocean floor, above the substrate. So they're free of predation, so they won't be at risk of predation. The twine is unwound onto a rope, and then they're suspended from these lines. And then immediately as they start to grow in the ocean, they're creating that habitat. That's really important timing too during outmigration for juvenile salmon. And we try to locate them on known routes of migratory pathways for salmon. So creating those little habitats and stopover places. And then after the kelp is grown to a certain length, we disattach it from the rope and tie it with a natural rubber band onto a rock. And then those are placed on the ocean floor. And then we monitor for their growth. And we're also throughout this time monitoring water quality and oceanographic conditions within these sites so we can learn where we're being successful and where we're having success with these outplantings, where the in-ocean nurseries are doing well and where they aren't. And yeah, just really trying to learn from each of these restoration projects in the marine environment.
So the kelp are kind of growing upside down towards the bottom, and then at a certain length, you flip them over and attach them to the ground, and then they're growing up again?
Yeah, well, so they're growing on a line that's suspended in the ocean. So
Yeah. Oh, so they're still growing
they're still
up.
growing up. Yeah.
Okay.
And then you just
I was
attach them,
thinking
and
like
then
they
you
go.
attach them to like, so the kelp will grow onto an anchor. And so then we'll place those on a rock.
Yeah. And are these like bull kelp, those really big ones with the big stipe?
No, we're doing macrocystis. So giant kelp.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know next to nothing about the ocean, but I know that one of my dreams is to swim around in a kelp forest. I think it would be really
Oh,
cool.
exactly. I know. So beautiful. And we're working with another group on a really cool project that's using cameras to identify which fish species are utilizing our in-ocean nurseries. And then they've trained AI to actually identify from the camera footage which species of fish. So
With these projects that are often like so far away from where people live, how do you get people in town on board or interested in that sort of
yeah,
thing?
it's something we're trying to do more and more of, especially like engaging Indigenous youth in our restoration work. And yeah, it takes like logistics really, just like boats and transportation and
Oh, so you get them out there.
yeah, to get people out there on the land. I think it's really key and important because, we can have these conversations and you might hear about a restoration and it might sound really cool, but until you actually see it, it's like it's so much more powerful to see it face to face. So, but again, a lot of our watersheds that we work in are so remote. It is really challenging to get people and costly to get people out there, but it's something we are looking for funding to do and making it more of a priority. So, especially with youth, again, just trying to inspire people from a young age to learn about this work and to know what's happening in their territories and their watersheds and to build those connections to these places from an early age. And then if we can't get them out there, then we lean back on the film and photos.
If you could tell a grade 12 student listening to this who's really wants to do what you do, if you give them some advice, what would that be?
Well, I would say I would reach out to nations in whose territory you live or stewardship groups who support those nations with recovery and restoration and see if you can test it out and see if you really do like it. And then I would say if you do show an interest and you are willing to and have the ability to go back to school, I would say pursuing a degree in biology or geography seems to be what most people in this field.
Geography.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it seems that like geography is so unique in that you learn a lot of the skills, you learn a lot about the industries, and you learn a lot about the ecosystems. And then you also learn a lot of like good skill sets too, like GIS and mapping. And so yeah, I find that a lot of our team come from a geography background, earth and ocean sciences, or biology.
What if you hate science but you're really good at media? Is that
Yeah.
are there uses for those people too?
Absolutely. And even like arts too. Like I found like a lot of our team are like, they're more on the education arts side. So, that's also maybe why we do a lot of like film and photography and, t-shirts and hats is like for those of us who have like more artistic side, again, you have a role to play in helping get the messaging and helping the wider public know about the work. So I think there is a role for so many different types of people in this work.
Just wrapping it up here, I want to go back to the Tranquil River because I've watched a couple of your videos on the Tranquil River, and it seems like, as you were saying, like one of these watersheds where you've worked in for a long time. Sometimes when it's like really depressing, I like to like try to picture a utopia where everything is good and this is what I'm aiming for. Do you have a mental picture of the Tranquil that is, what you want it to be? What does it look like? What does it smell like when you walk down there? What does it sound like?
Well, I think sound is easy. I think I would think of the river and I would hear riffles, but they maybe from time to time wouldn't be water riffling everywhere. There might be slower pockets of water because there's a lot of pool habitat and slower areas where finer sediments are settling out and where salmon are resting and getting a break as they migrate upstream. I also hear a lot more songbirds because the forest is healthy and there's lots of understory vegetation and young trees and old trees. So I definitely would hear the birds and the eagles and the kingfishers, and they're flying up and down the river and enjoying all those young salmon. For the river itself, I think the fact that I'm hearing that slower moving water or not hearing the riffles as often is a sign that we've created lots of pool habitat and we've broken up these extended riffles by putting wood back in the river. I think that we have berry bushes growing in the banks of the river and lush vegetation is a sign that we've also, had an influence on the hydrology and we are during peak winter storms sending water back up into the floodplain and storing that water longer and sending all the carcasses of the salmon up into the floodplain, which is fertilizing all of those plants. I would hope that I'd look up on the hill slopes and see alder growing on all of the landslides and less of those scars present across the hill slopes. And I hope that I'd hiked in and I didn't drive in because the roads had all been deactivated and the culverts had all been pulled. And we're storing water longer in the watershed and we're slowing the rate at which it's delivered to the river. So I'd like to, maybe I had to hike in or canoe up the river because it's so deep now. You can canoe up it. It's no longer wide and shallow. You have to portage your canoe. So, yeah, I think I definitely have a picture in my mind. And then I see all the smiling faces that have worked so hard on working in this watershed and planting those trees. So, all those people that have been a part of this healing process. I think every time we go there as a team, we're always like full of smiles because we're so happy with where that watershed has gotten to and where, we've seen it over the last 7 years and its recovery. So yeah, I hope all those smiling faces are there too.
As you were saying that, I was just like picturing this amazing watershed I've never been to. And it's like, wow, yeah. It's amazing how much you can see about a watershed when you work in it and you understand all the processes that go on versus if you didn't know that much, you could just walk in and be like, this looks pretty good, right? This is pretty beautiful. Yeah. So we've asked everybody this, just very simply, why are salmon more than a fish?
Well, I guess, yeah, salmon are more than a fish. They mean so much to people. They mean so much to every ecosystem that they occupy. They are architects of landscape. We often, I think the beaver gets a lot of credit as like, the architect, it's shaping the land, but I think salmon don't get enough credit for shaping the land. We often talk about, salmon fertilize the trees that grow on the banks of the river. Yes, but let's dig into that. So they are a part of making massive trees on the landscape. So that has like shaped these entire watersheds. It shapes rivers, it shapes understory vegetation, it shapes the types of invertebrates that occupy these riparian zones and the bats that fly up and down the river. In the marine environment, they are so integral to megafauna like killer whales and sea lions and seals. And so that's just like the ecological factors. And then we take into like the human and in so many cultures, like, the indigenous culture, we can start there. And what I couldn't even express in my own words, what salmon mean to those nations. And each species of salmon means to different seasons for the nations and how this shaped their lives. So that is fundamental. And then even to this day, how it shapes life here on the coast and how much salmon are a part of, our daily life, our diet, our recreational activities. And then for us, for our work too, they're just salmon are everything.
That was a great way to end it. Thank you so much for being on this show. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I want to acknowledge that this episode was recorded on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands.
Raincoast Radio is hosted by Austin Shore and produced by me, Sophia Osborne. This podcast is a production of Raincoast Conservation Foundation, a team of conservationists and scientists empowered by research to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of coastal British Columbia. Learn more and support our work at raincoast.org.